Hello and welcome to the forum. My name is Bobby Ghosh. I'm with Bloomberg Opinion. I am delighted to welcome to this conversation Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan from Singapore. He scarcely needs any introductions, but I will go through the motions anyway. Ambassador Kausikan has been a 37-year veteran of the Singaporean Foreign Ministry, and he's served in many capacities, including as ambassador to the Russian Federation, as permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. He is now chairman of the Middle East Institute, but my favorite line from his bio runs as follows. It says, the Raffles Institution, the University of Singapore, and Columbia University in New York all attempted to educate him. I think they did a fine job, and I can think of very few people who would be more appropriate for this conversation. We'll try to keep it as conversational as possible. I will speak as little as possible so that we can get the benefit of Ambassador Kausikan's vast experience and wisdom. There's obviously an 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is the American election. So I will start by asking the ambassador, what are your views on overall on the result and what that might mean, not for any specific reason, but for diplomacy, for international diplomacy as a whole?
Well, Bobby, American elections, especially presidential elections, but actually any election, are what I call weather events. You can't do anything about the weather. You have to live with it. Whether it's raining, whether it's hot, it's cold, it's wet, it's dry, you live with it, right?
Yeah.
You can adapt yourself to it. You know, you think it's going to rain, for God's sake, bring an umbrella with you, right? But you live with it. That said, I don't think there is any expectation that Mr. Biden is going to fundamentally change the trajectory on core issues. And the core issue is, of course, US-China relations. There's no other issue as important as that.
Yeah.
I think there's a very broad consensus, both in the United States as well as outside the United States, which I include China too, that there is a bipartisan consensus on taking a tougher approach towards China.
Yes.
It's not something Mr. Trump or his advisors one day woke up, in the morning and say, what shall we do today? Let's take a tough approach towards China. No, this has been building up for many years.
Yes.
For basically concerns about Chinese behavior have been building up for many years. And what's particularly important is in the business sector, for all the reasons you know. Now, so I don't expect that it's going to be fundamental change in this core issue.
Yeah, but if you don't mind my,
he will try to fine-tune the relationship. And I can elaborate on that later, but sorry, I interrupted you. You were about to...
No, I was going to interrupt you. Before we go down into the details of China and how China perceives these developments, I wanted to get from you as a diplomat, how important in international diplomacy is tone, is the tone from the White House. And of course, we know that the past year there's been a particularly interesting, if I can be polite, tone from the White House, and that's going to change. Is that important, or are fundamental issues just too important for tone to matter at all?
No, tone matters, but we shouldn't exaggerate how much it matters.
Okay.
The substance of issues, the substance of concerns, that is far more important. Tone is, how should I put it? Tone is important, of course, but it's a secondary issue. Okay. It's not a core issue.
Okay. So back to China. If you were sitting in Beijing now, if you were a senior Chinese government official, what are you looking for in the next 2 months during the transition period? What signals are you looking for from the Biden camp, if any? And what actions are you expecting from Trump as he heads out of the door?
Well, first of all, I think China, and I think almost everybody in what we now call the Indo-Pacific, would not expect fundamental shifts.
Okay.
What Mr. Biden will do is something in the nature of fine-tuning.
Okay.
Don't forget, and I don't think anybody in China or in Japan or in Singapore, in Australia, anywhere, right, India, will forget that Mr. Biden does not come to the White House with entirely free hands. He has a divided party. The Democratic Party is divided. It still is divided. They contain their divisions while fighting the election, but it will come out again.
Yeah.
The country is divided. Look, there were 70-odd million Americans who thought Mr. Trump was fine. They voted for him, right?
Yeah.
And that's a fact. You can't wish it away, right?
Yes.
And it looks like, of course, the results are not in yet, but it looks like you're going to have a divided Congress.
Yes.
With the Republicans maintaining control of the Senate. And the Republicans and the Democrats losing some seats in the House. So he doesn't have a completely free hand. What he can do, I mean, there are things he can do immediately, and they are not easy, but they are relatively straightforward. He can start working with the WHO again. He can begin the process of rejoining the Paris Accord on climate change. Okay, he can do things like that, and as you said, he can change the tone. He can put into place a more orderly process by which decisions are made and communicated, a more traditional way of communicating American policy, rather than tweets and things like that.
Yes.
There can be better coordination with friends and allies, and perhaps, while he can't, at least not immediately, change direction abruptly, he could be less trigger happy about tariffs, about implementing certain regulations, restrictions on China.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think we also should not lose sight of the fact, and I'm sure the Chinese and all of us in this region don't lose sight of the fact, Mr. Biden has made clear his priority is domestic. And that is important, because foreign policy begins at home, right? I would put it this way, at least for the first 6, 7, 8, 9 months, he's not only going to be putting his people into place, but he's going to be focusing on domestic issues, how to deal with the economic and health consequences of the pandemic, which is far from over, not just in America, but in the world. And let's put it this way, like say if on a scale of 100, for the first 6 months, I would expect him to spend 80 to 90% of his time on domestic issues. And I would expect nothing else. I'll be, in fact, worried if he didn't do so.
Yeah.
And then the question arises, in that 20%, 10 to 20% that's left, how does he prioritize? There's a whole long agenda of stuff.
Yes.
Not just China. Within the China account, there's a whole long agenda of stuff. But the China account is just one on a long agenda of stuff. Then I think China and all of us will be watching very carefully. First of all, because most of his time is going to be spent on domestic stuff and should be spent on domestic stuff, who he appoints as Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, Secretary of Treasury, the cabinet, but certain cabinet appointments will be very carefully scrutinized. They're always important, but in this circumstance, perhaps more important than normal. Secondly, I think we'll be looking for clues, not just in appointments, but what he says during his inauguration, and perhaps more important, what he says in the first State of the Union. So this is some months ahead, right?
Yes.
But there's also one more factor. He was Mr. Obama's vice president. And therefore, he cannot avoid responsibility for what happened on Obama's watch, whether they are good things and they are bad things. We know all the good things. I mean, in this part of the world, Obama did many good things. It was very soothing, comforting to listen to him talk about pivoting to Asia, paying more attention to Asia. It was quite flattering when he made the time to attend, I think, all but one ASEAN meeting.
Yes.
The opening to Myanmar was a very important masterstroke, actually, I would call it. And the TPP is a really substantive achievement in a region, our region, where trade is strategy. But it was not as if everything before Trump was some kind of pre-lapsarian Eden. There were weaknesses, particularly in the second Obama administration. Weaknesses in the South China Sea, in the Middle East, and so on, which created, and I think it's more than impression, which revealed that he was rather reluctant to use power, hard power, I mean.
Yes.
One of the most damaging things, I'll just give you a few, right? Look, 2012, the Obama administration brokered a disengagement agreement between the Philippines, a US ally, and China over Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea. China promptly broke it. The US did nothing. 2016, Xi Jinping met President Obama and said quite explicitly he would not militarize the South China Sea. Now, you can argue about what he really meant by militarize, but the fact is, South China Sea has been militarized with a very small fig leaf of using the Coast Guard rather than the PLA Navy.
Yeah.
And in the Middle East, I think this is one of the most damaging things that happened. He drew a red line in Syria and did not enforce it. And that kind of eroded the credibility of American power everywhere. So everything, and Mr. Biden, justly or unjustly, and who says life is fair, is going to be held at least partly culpable with in these things. So every move he makes in the first few months, or maybe the first year or so, is going to be carefully scrutinized. And
is it your sense that Biden has a greater appetite for exercising hard power than Obama did? And the corollary question would be, given that now so many years have passed, are the circumstances in those examples that you gave, do the circumstances now allow for an exercise of American hard power?
Why do they not allow? I mean, look, Mr. Trump didn't understand foreign policy. He didn't care to understand foreign policy. But he seemed to have an instinctive feel for power. You look at his business career and all that, right? You can call it bullying, but bullying is a form of power.
Yes.
He exercised it crudely, he exercised it in an incoherent way, but he did exercise it. Now, Mr. Biden is a veteran. I can't remember how many years he served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He knows about foreign policy, he knows about diplomacy, he knows it can't be just about soft power. You need both, right? And he knows that the most dangerous issues in Asia are hard power issues. South China Sea, North Korea, Taiwan Straits, Senkakus, Himalayas. You can't deal with this by soft power.
Right.
No, look, but there was cause to doubt, at least in the second Obama administration, whether some of his appointees understood soft power, hard power. Look, one of the most ill-considered statements I ever heard is Mr. Kerry, who was the Secretary of State in the second administration, criticizing Russia's behavior in the Ukraine as 19th century behavior in the 21st century. Now, I'm not saying there was nothing to criticize about Russian behavior. There's plenty to criticize. But that particular criticism suggested that that was based on the assumption that your competitor, your adversary, your rival should follow your own rules and your own values. Why should they? Unless you have the muscle and the will to exercise it to make them respect your values and your rules. Now, I think we don't want to judge one way or the other, but people will be watching Mr. Biden's every move. friend or foe will be watching to answer the question that you posed.
Yes.
Right? So we don't know yet, but certainly people will watch.
If I can go back to something that you said at the start of this answer, which is that Biden inherits a divided nation, a divided Congress, even a divided world, given how polarized everything has become. But if I were to put it to you that one of the very few things that unites this country, unite the political spectrum, and unite much of the world, not all, but much of the world, is a fear of China. Rational, irrational, deserved, undeserved. That's what going into those issues. But the fact is, China is sort of on top of a lot of people's minds. There has been an expectation of American leadership in responding to China, and there seems to be sort of a disagreement over whether Trump was leading the world in the right way. Would you agree with that assessment that's one area where Biden might actually be able to get a consensus at home and abroad?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, there's already a consensus that in the United States that straddles the political divide that America should take a tougher position towards China. And you are absolutely right. I think whatever reservations people around the world may have had on Mr. Trump's means, I think there was a broad consensus on his goals.
Yes.
You can argue whether the means were the best way to achieve those goals, but the goals. And this is because, comes back to your question on tone, right?
Yes.
Why are these, if there is a nascent coalition, global coalition of countries with concerns about China, it's not because of anything Mr. Trump did, it's because of everything Mr. Xi Jinping did.
Yes.
Also, there are concerns about Chinese behavior. Now, not everybody has the same concerns, not everybody has the same intensity of concerns, but the concerns are there.
Yes.
And Mr. Biden, I don't think is going to, as I said, not going to fundamentally shift trajectory, but he can use this. There is a basis,
You're right?
For working together, not to put together a containment coalition, because people's attitudes to China are complex.
Yeah.
Right? There is no country, no major economy that I know, or even some minor ones, that doesn't have some concerns about China.
Yeah.
But at the same time, China is a very important part of the world economy, and nobody wants to treat China as an enemy. In fact, it's not an enemy. You know, if I may go on and elaborate this a little bit,
Please.
I have been very disturbed. I'm very annoyed, I would say, by this loose use of the term New Cold War to describe US-China relations. I think it's a totally inappropriate metaphor. Why? The Soviet Union and China and the United States interacted only peripherally. They led two different systems, and the competition was between two different systems. Now, China and the US are both vital parts of one system, one global economic system, and they are enmeshed in supply chains of a density, of a scope, of a complexity, of an intricacy that have never before been seen in a global economy.
Yes.
Now, this fact conditions their competition and bounds their competition. It makes it much more complicated. Even the United States, right? Look, they have stumbled on a great vulnerability in China, which is semiconductors. Right? China is in some trouble. Huawei is in some trouble.
Yes.
Right? On the other hand, China is about 40% of the world semiconductor market. You can't just cut it off 100% without hurting your own industries and the industries of your friends and allies. So it's a much more complex situation than the old Cold War, if you like, right?
Right.
And I think that complexity creates opportunity for the new administration to put together a more coherent response to the concerns everybody shares, but also poses some challenges.
We'll get to some of the other countries in Asia and in the world and how they would be viewing the change in the White House. But before that, when it comes to implementing American policy, whatever those policies may be, whether it's to China or any other issue in the world, one of the signature achievements is not the right word, but one of the things that the Trump administration did was significantly dismantle the State Department. The principal instrument of American foreign policy was greatly dismantled, weakened. We saw an exodus of professional diplomats. We saw a politicization of what previously would be considered purely diplomatic activity. The appointment of very, very large numbers, much greater proportion of political appointees than any previous administration. As a career diplomat yourself, can you give us an assessment of how badly do you think the State Department has been damaged by this? How easy or difficult will it be to bounce back from it? What are the difficulties that the new administration will face in repairing the State Department?
Look, I mean, I think I ought to apologize to all my friends in the American State Department before I answer this question. So I apologize to all of you in advance. I love you still and so on. Don't take me the wrong way. But I have, from the day I joined the Singapore Foreign Ministry, one of my first jobs was to be the desk officer for America. One thing that struck me from the very beginning was how politicized it was.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true of Republican administrations, Democratic administrations. I know of no other foreign service that routinely, when there's a change of administration, even if it's the same party, changes appointments right down to DAS level and sometimes lower. That's unique to the American system. Right. Trump is an extension of that, right? The State Department has survived many such transitions, and there is a great wealth of foreign policy, national security, defense policy talent in the United States, which is at Mr. Biden's disposal, Republican and Democrat, right? So that is not my big worry at all.
Okay.
It's something to think about, but it's not something we should exaggerate to. They will bounce back. They have always bounced back. This may be a bigger bounce necessary, but it's not in principle different from what things they have faced before.
Well, that's reassuring. So back to Asia. We've talked a lot about China. Apart from China now, what are the other major Asian countries, Japan, India? What do you think they will be expecting from a Biden administration in the bilateral sense, but of course also in the sense of the US and China?
Well, first of all, I think Mr. Biden has already made one move. He made phone calls to the leaders of Japan, South Korea, and I think Australia too. Right? Yeah. And that's very important because it shows an emphasis on allies. Right? And I think that will be very reassuring to all these countries because what I said vis-a-vis China would also apply to all these countries. The kinds of concerns, the kinds of things people are thinking through. Yeah. I would expect him to make a phone call to Mr. Modi very soon. And then he will go down the list. But as I said, I don't expect visits or anything, that pandemic aside, because he has a very strong domestic agenda. Yeah. I think the allies, he's taken the first step. He has reassured the allies that, Asian allies, that, he understands the importance of these relationships. And which is not a surprise, as I told you, he's been in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for, I can't even remember how many years, right? Yeah. The next step will be to reach out by phone calls or perhaps by trips once he has got his team in place to second-tier countries, I would say. They are not allies but friends, right? India, some of the ASEAN countries, and so on, right?
Right.
And all these countries will be looking at essentially the same things as what I mentioned about China.
Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of the Quad under the Trump administration and where you think that development is going in the next couple of years?
Okay, I think the Quad is a reflection of what I was talking about spreading concerns about certain aspects of Chinese behavior.
Yeah.
Right? Not India, Japan, Australia, US, they don't have exactly the same concerns and they don't hold them with exactly the same intensity, right? But they have concerns. How the Quad will, what I think is going to change, I mean, Mr. Pompeo's idea of the Quad, of very hard containment, I don't think the other three members are very enthusiastic about it, even close allies like Australia and Japan. For the reasons I mentioned, relationships are not straightforward these days. People have concerns about China. People don't want to make China an enemy, and they have interest in China.
Yeah.
So how it evolves will really depend on the extent to which China will modify its behavior.
Right. And do you expect China to modify its behavior with the new man at the White House?
I think they have taken a wait-and-see approach. You know that they haven't congratulated Mr. Biden yet.
Yes.
They are waiting for the Electoral College vote, which doesn't mean that they are missing Trump. It means that they are being very, very cautious. Huh?
Yeah.
Right? Because, I think there is a limit to which China can modify its behavior. I tell you why. There is a fact about China that is so obvious that it's almost invisible. That fact is that China is a communist country. We often forget that or downplay it. Of course, it's not communist in its ideology anymore. Its ideology is really nationalist.
Yes.
But in the political structure is of a Leninist state, a state in which a vanguard party claims a monopoly of power and control. Right? Now that fact is the root cause of a lot of the structural issues that other countries find in the economic sphere unfair. Because the party has a privileged position and the Chinese business, there's no Chinese business that can exist without cultivating a close kind of symbiotic relationship with the party. So of course they will get favors. But what is normal behavior in China is considered unfair everywhere else. So they can, and they're not going, okay, you take, there are concerns about state-owned enterprise, the privileged position. But state-owned enterprises are part of this Leninist system.
Yeah.
And Mr. Xi has emphasized that. Even as he says the private sector is important, he said state-owned enterprises are important. And they are important from his frame. So there will be, you can make tactical adjustments. Some have already been made. For example, you may have noticed that these so-called wolf warriors, who are much more talking to a domestic audience in China than doing what diplomats ought to do, have been toning down their howls. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but these are tactical adjustments. Those can be made. Say the South China Sea. Why do the Chinese have these extravagant claims based on history rather than law? Because the Chinese Communist Party today legitimates itself by a historical narrative of humiliation and redemption under its rule. And part of that narrative of redemption or rejuvenation is, I was weak, I lost these things. I'm strong, I got them back. So they're not going to back down. They can't, without undermining their own nationalist ideology. And I can give you more examples, but I think I made the point. I don't want to belabor it. So they can adjust. They are very flexible. They're not like the Soviet Communist Party that was very rigid. They can adjust, but around the periphery. And in a way, Mr. Xi Jinping has made it more difficult to adjust because of his concentration of power, because of the severe penalties because of his renewed emphasis on party control, party discipline, and so on. He has introduced some new vulnerabilities into the Chinese system. They are not fatal vulnerabilities, I want to emphasize that. But, let's not expect them to, okay, let's put it this way. Before Mr. Trump, all was not good. After Mr. Trump, all will not be good.
Can you expand a little on those vulnerabilities that you were talking about?
Okay, I give you one. This is a central core vulnerability.
Yeah.
Of China, right? As early as the 18th Party Congress, and in fact, even earlier, 2007 or 2008, then Premier Wen Xiaopao said more or less the same thing. At this 18th Congress, which was 2012, the Chinese Communist Party acknowledged publicly that the growth model that had created the spectacular growth of the 1990s, early 2000s was not sustainable. And a new growth model was needed. The next year, 2013, they rolled out their new growth model, which envisaged a decisive role for the market. That term decisive role is theirs, not mine, right? But implementation has, to put it kindly, been patchy and hesitant. Why? Because the essence of the new model was they acknowledged they needed more market efficiency, right? Instead of just relying on infrastructure investment, led by state-owned enterprise and so on. They need to make better use, improve productivity, make better use of resources. But market and control are almost diametrically opposed concepts.
Yes.
And the primary value of a Leninist party, which the Chinese Communist Party is control. Now, these are not, the choice is not absolute. It's what balance between control and market efficiency. And that's not so easy to determine. And it requires some risks. And there, so far, under Mr. Xi, the balance has been towards control. There has been some market reform, particularly in the financial sector, but even there, recently, what happened to Mr. Jack Ma.
Yes.
There were good technical reasons, I would say, for stopping the IPO, right? But it was also a reminder to him who is boss.
Boss, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, since you now run the Middle East Institute, I think it would be good to hear your views on how you think the dynamic of the Middle East in the last 4 or 5 years, is that, like the dynamic with China, is that also something that it's too late for the United States to change? Has it now taken on its own logic and its own inevitable motion? Or is there something you feel that a Biden administration might be able to do to slow down the process, change the direction? What do you think?
Well, it depends how you define the dynamic.
Well, let's split it down.
Our definition may not be the same.
Yeah, let's break this down. Let's start with, let's say, so in three areas. So the Gulf states and their evolution and the development of their hostility with Iran. Turkey at the other end of the picture. Turkey's increasingly sort of separate position from the Western consensus, from NATO, and in the middle of these two, the Levant, so the developments in Syria primarily. So if we can think about these three categories, what do you think that the Biden administration might be able to do to change any dynamic there?
Okay, first of all, I think beyond these three categories, there are bigger macro forces or macro factors. One is, I think, the kind of involvement in ground wars in the Middle East has been widely acknowledged as a mistake.
Yes.
And what links the Obama administration to the Trump administration is the desire to pull back from that overextension, right? Obama did it in a hesitant way. Trump did it in a kind of an ill-considered way, right? But it's the same. Second, and that's, I don't think, going to change because the nature of American interests in the Middle East has changed. You are not longer, the Quincy Accord, the basis of the Quincy Accord doesn't hold because you don't need that energy as vitally as you used to need, right? And that's not going to change because that's for a variety of technological, ecological, political factors, that trajectory is more or less set. It can go faster, it can go slower, but it's set. So I don't think, so the changes, I will say that even in my own institute, not everybody agrees with me, and they shouldn't, right? But I don't think there's going to be, again, fundamental change. There will be fine-tuning.
Okay.
In this respect. I think the pulling back from an overextension to being an offshore balancer
right.
is going to continue. I don't think, this has been wrongly described, I think, when Trump was president, or when Trump is still president, during the Trump administration, as a retreat from the Middle East. I would say it's a recalibration of his engagement of the Middle East. Because I don't see the Fifth Fleet leaving Bahrain. I don't see the US Air Force leaving Qatar, right? Okay, so, but those are offshore balancing forces, yes, instead of getting involved in ground forces. That will continue. Second, what you mentioned, the divide between the Sunni Arab states and Iran predates Trump, predates Obama. It goes back, perhaps you can say, to even predates the Iranian Revolution, although that is accelerated. You could go back to maybe the 73 war, and right, and or even earlier. You can go back to Saudis emphasizing Wahhabism, at least, as a counter to Nasser's Arab nationalism, which is not only secular, it was also Republican.
Yes.
But, okay, the Iran Revolution accelerating. So this is a long-term trend. And it poses, I think, a dilemma and a challenge for a Biden administration's Middle East policy. First of all, don't forget that Biden has a long-standing relationship with Israel. He is a long-standing supporter of Israeli security, and I don't think that's going to change. Right? He may make some gestures which Trump was not prepared to do towards the Palestinians. But that's another issue because the Palestinians have a lot of responsibility on their own shoulders.
Yes.
Okay. But at the same time, he has said during the campaign, which is probably not the best, what he said during the campaign is not always a very good indicator of policy. But anyway, he said it, that he wants to somehow come back to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Now that's much easier said than done, particularly if the Republicans hold the Senate, right? And don't forget there is a election in Iran next year.
That's right.
Right, and all that has happened, I think, in my judgment, has strengthened the hand of those who are those in Iran who are not very enthusiastic about the JCPOA in the first place. Right. So, but at the same time, he has also said, and I think he means it too, that he wants to encourage more Arab states to reach out to Israel. Now, the reason the Arab states are reaching out to Israel is Iran. So yes, there is a certain contradiction in the goals he wants to pursue. How he will pursue it, I don't know. Now, to come back to your framework, right? Now, I look at the Middle East coldly and clinically. Let's look at it clinically. There is a northern tier, and there's the Gulf, and there's North Africa. I'll leave North Africa minus Egypt out of this for a minute, right? If you look at the northern tier, Iraq is a failed state. Syria is a failed state. Lebanon is a failed state, right? Turkey and Iran had fairly decent economies, but due to mismanagement, they are in dire straits right now. these are not things that any administration can fix. In fact, in the northern tier, the only viable real economy is Israel.
Yes.
Right? Jordan is fragile, Egypt is fragile. Right? The Gulf is more interesting in the sense. Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman is undertaking a bold experiment. Economic diversification away from dependence on a single commodity, which cannot be done without social changes, cultural changes, and so on, and some are already in place. One of my last trips before we all got locked up in our own countries was to the Gulf and to Saudi Arabia. I had not been there for 8 years. This was last September, November. And I was quite impressed by some of the things I saw. I saw women not covering their heads anymore. Not a whole lot of them, but some don't, right? Mm-hmm. I saw women working. And not working. By working, I don't mean serving tea. I mean real work, right? And those are good things. So I think what is being attempted in Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is the key. I mean, UAE has done this long ago. Qatar has done this long ago. Oman has done this long ago. Kuwait, in a more hesitant way, it has done it, right? But the key is Saudi Arabia, right? And I think no right-thinking person would want them to fail, but any clinical person would have questions about whether they will succeed.
Well, since you brought up Saudi Arabia,
again, that's not something that America can help very much.
Yeah, I take your point. I take your point on that. But since you brought up Saudi Arabia and MBS, so much of the relationship between the Saudis and the US in the last 4 years has been intensely personal. It's MBS and the Trump family. That now changes. There is not a Biden family relationship with MBS. How does that change the calculus for Saudi Arabia, do you think?
Well, I think they will have less leeway. They will have to, I think human rights will play a larger role in the agenda of US-Saudi relations.
Yeah.
Khashoggi and all that sort of stuff, right?
Yes.
But I think it is still a key player in the Gulf. You can't get away from that, right? And any American administration, even as it recalibrates the way it engages the Middle East, will have to deal with Saudi Arabia in some way. It won't have that kind of personal blank check approach that Trump adopted, right? But it's still going to be an important partner in the Middle East. No getting away from it.
Should we expect more American pressure for a resolution to the split within the GCC countries between Qatar and the others?
Well, I think the Trump administration did try after its initial thing. It did try. It didn't work because again, I think we shouldn't exaggerate the extent to which people. All right, look, put it this way: every major power. US, Soviet Union, before them Britain, France, right? They've always gone to the Middle East and never been able to control the dynamic.
No.
The tail always wags the dog. Because these countries are complex countries, they have their own internal dynamics where outsiders can have only a limited influence.
Right. And
I think that will be true of Biden. It was true even on during Trump's time. The only difference is he didn't particularly care.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's going to change very much. I think there will be a slightly more. There won't be a blank check anymore, right? There will be a bit more emphasis on human rights. There will be more, but I think I can't see any American administration not supporting the kind of reforms that the Saudi leadership says it wants to make.
Well, I think I've just got my cue. We're down to less than a minute now, so I want to take this time to thank you, Ambassador, for sharing your insight with us. Thank you for joining us in this conversation. I'm sure the audience will have gained a great deal of understanding. of the world when it's seen from a different vantage point than many are used to. Thank you very much again.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Bobby. I'm glad to meet you, and I hope to meet you in person before too long.
Inshallah, as they say in Delaware.
Inshallah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.